Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be here and to see so many familiar faces. Thank you. A couple of quick thank yous. Thank you so much to Walter Cruttenden, Jeff Patino, and others at CPAC for making this gathering possible and bringing us all together. And I think that I know Walter disagrees with me a lot on this, but I think we live in a time of extraordinary spiritual darkness today. I think it's perhaps the darkest time in the last 5,000 years. Sure, we all have these gadgets and this technology, and we have antibiotics, but there are forces at work in our society that have tried to shut down the gigantic potential of the human mind and reduce us just to passive consumers of material goods. But I also think there's hope, and I see that hope in a gathering like this, like-minded people who want to do what's good and want to do what's right, and most of all want to think freely, not to be told what we may think or what we may do with our unconsciousness. I'd like to give a very special thank you to my wife, Santa, who took all the photographs we'll be seeing. Santa is my constant traveling companion. We've had so many adventures, confronted so many dangers over the last 18 years. I couldn't have written a word I wrote if it hadn't been for Santa by my side. So thank you, Santa. That's the world as we know it today. Pretty familiar? This is the world at the last glacial maximum, 21,300 years ago. Rather different. If you look at it closely, the Red Sea's filled in, there's no Arabian Gulf, there's a huge extension here in Southeast Asia, quite a lot of extra land over here in the west. Actually, 10 million square miles of land was lost when the sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. That's Europe and China added together, by the way. When the sea level rose, when the Ice Age began to melt down, it wasn't a gradual drip, drip, drip. There were explosive releases of meltwater. Sometimes sea level would rise as much as 3 feet virtually overnight in geological terms. Gigantic waves of water rushing down those 2-mile-high ice caps, waves that might reach a height of 600 feet and would travel at 1,000 miles an hour. Unbelievable devastation was caused as these meltwaters rushed back into the world ocean. I think it's a no-brainer that the worldwide tradition and myth of the flood must be a memory of this period. Yes, we are a species with amnesia, but the myths that have come down to us from deepest antiquity are our memory of the time that we have not recorded in historical documents. And indeed, the story of the flood is truly global. Plato's Atlantis, perhaps the most famous version of this story. It's very interesting that in all the flood, whether it's the Indian flood myth, whether it's Plato, whether it's the myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha in Greece, that all of these flood myths implicate mankind's behavior in some way in the disaster that is inflicted upon us. It is not only a blind geological process, something that human beings do, some behavior of humans, some arrogance, some pride, some greed, some cruelty. These are the things that bring down upon us the anger of the gods and that lose us the mandate of heaven. And I have to say, if ever there were a society that looks in mythological terms like the next lost civilization, it's ours. Unless we choose to do something about it, to take responsibility for what is being done in our name by our governments, are governments of evil men, by and large. The story of Noah, again, if you examine that story, you'll see that God was not pleased with the way that humans behaved. The same comes from the root source of the story of Noah, the Gilgamesh epic from Sumeria. In there we read that the gods became vexed at the huge noise that mankind was making. It really was too much. So they sent the flood to quieten us down. And interestingly enough, if you go to the Arabian Gulf and you look at how it was during the meltdown of the Ice Age, you'll find that 14 and a half, this is the last glacial maximum, 21,000 years ago. The Gulf is completely dry land, a wonderful river system flowing through it to the Straits of Hormuz. Just a little encroachment by 16,400 years ago, but between then and then, the entire Arabian Gulf was flooded, and much of it at around 12,000 plus, 12,400 years ago, rather suddenly. I don't think we need to look much further to understand the origin of the flood myth. Australia has changed shape dramatically since the end of the last ice age, and again we find flood myths in Australia, memories of this ancient historical period. But I think more has come down to us than the myths. I've, for many years, been intrigued with the mysteries of ancient maps, and I've written about them in Fingerprints of the Gods and also extensively in Underworld. And I think that these maps, and I follow in great footsteps of Charles Hapgood in saying this, are documentary evidence of a much higher level of civilization at some time in remote antiquity. I don't mean maps like these, which were the standard fare in the Middle Ages. East is to the north in these maps. This would be Jerusalem up here. Here's the Nile River going into Africa. Here's Spain. Here's Northwest Africa. I mean, you really wouldn't like to try to find your way around with one of these things. And that was it. That was the level of map-making technology right through until the 1280s or 1290s. And then, resurrected from the past, came out again the works of Claudius Ptolemy, which had been preserved through the Dark Ages in a few monasteries. A set of coordinates, really, which were then redrawn. And the first of these were brought back actually in 1295. And actually mariners could work with these maps. They're not perfect, they have problems, but interesting level of precision. Another cartographic tradition appears at exactly the same time, the Portolan tradition. Nobody knows where this came from. Suddenly mariners are just using these incredible maps, which have really fantastic detail in certain areas, particularly in the Mediterranean. And you could steer by these maps. They're as good as any map that's been drawn today. They just appear from nowhere. And Hapgood's argument was that it isn't actually from nowhere that these maps came, that perhaps they had been in the Library of Alexandria, that some had been preserved and carried away when the library was destroyed, perhaps taken to Constantinople, released again during the Crusades. Mariners immediately saw their potential and started to make use of them. So possibly a very ancient tradition. And he traces the Portolanos back to Marinus of Tyre, a predecessor of Ptolemy. They're a source for both the Ptolemaic and these maps, and yet they varied in some interesting ways. The Piri-Reis map, of course, very famous, and interestingly, it appears to show Antarctica and at the tip of South America, and Antarctica as it looked during the last ice age. This is what Antarctica looks like today. This is what Antarctica looked like in the 19th century. Our civilization hadn't discovered Antarctica until 1818, and so maps drawn in the early 19th century, like this Russian map, just contain an empty space where Antarctica is. But weirdly, if you go back to the 16th, 15th century, you find Antarctica all over the place. You know, how do we explain this when it wasn't to be discovered for another 300 years unless somebody had discovered it before? It just occurs again and again on these ancient maps. And there's other curious details too. There's a map shows a little island off the coast of Ireland. Such an island did exist until 12,400 years ago. And we can see it in the contour map here in exactly the right place. How did they know that there had been an island there? Or are we looking at a fragment of knowledge passed down from deep antiquity? Here's the Waldseemüller map. It's another Ptolemaic map. I want to draw your attention to this area in particular. The modern world, the world as it looked at the last glacial maximum, and the world depicted, Southeast Asia depicted in this map. I think there's astonishing similarities. Again, a preservation of a memory of a world very different from the world we live in today. Another map, this one's Chinese, shows the Korean peninsula, but it shows it in a very narrowed and shortened form, and the last time the Korean peninsula looked like this was about 12,400 years ago. You have to allow perhaps years of leeway on either side with this. The resolution isn't perfect, but that's roughly the period that this map seems to be depicting. Some interesting thoughts about Japan and Taiwan on ancient maps. In the Ptolemaic maps, Ptolemy didn't know about North America, although it appears that the parallel source from which the Portolanos drew did. And Ptolemy's got the size of the world roughly right, but he just figured Asia was much bigger. So the general view at that period for the 1400s was that if you sailed west, you would hit the coast of Asia. And there's these two curious islands shown between Europe and what was perhaps Asia on this map, and I just want to look at them a little bit closely. They're called Satanaze and Antillia, and Professor Robert Fusson has made in my view, invincible argument that although they're depicted in what we now think of as the Atlantic Ocean, they do actually represent Japan and Taiwan. But what's really curious is when do they represent Japan and Taiwan? I'm working from inundation maps produced by Dr. Glenn Milne at the University of Durham. He's one of the world's leading scientists in tracking sea level rise. And here's Taiwan as it looked 12,400 years ago. And here's the island of Antillia as it's shown in that ancient map. And again, to my mind, particularly with this island off the side here, a remarkable memory. Japan, as it looks today, as it looked 12,400 years ago, I believe that this island of Satanaze is a representation of Japan, where the three main islands were all joined together in one landmass as it looked 12,400 years ago. Just a reminder of the situation in Southeast Asia at the last glacial maximum. The whole east coast of China is extended, and Japan is welded into one landmass. Taiwan today, Taiwan 12,400 years ago. Let's go diving, and that's what you find in between the straits between Taiwan and China. A huge wall. I'm going to have to run through these slides very, very quickly, but I do not believe for a moment that this is a natural feature. And if you look into broken areas, you can see the individual blocks of stone that were put in position to build this wall. Let's turn east from Taiwan. We come to the island of Yonaguni. Santa and I have put in more than 200 dives at Yonaguni. And I just want to move you quickly through the underwater monuments that are found there, and which, according to Glenn Milne's data, have been underwater for more than 11,000 years. Two parallel walls with a ramp curving between them. A tunnel. I'm just photographed swimming through the tunnel there. You can see that the tunnel is built of megalithic blocks placed on top of one another. Ahead of me as I exit the tunnel is this extraordinary pair of huge parallel slabs of stone. Geologists would like to argue that they fell intact from overhead somehow. I'm doubtful of that argument. If we continue in an eastwards direction, swimming around here, we come to the famous terraces of Yonaguni. I cannot agree that these terraces are simply the result of the sea beating against softer layers of rock and removing the softer and selectively leaving the harder layers behind. I can see how that argument can be made, but I think that the site itself defeats that argument in a number of ways. Just some comparisons between terraced monuments from Peru and terraced monuments underwater in Japan. These universally accepted as man-made, these universally derided as natural features. If the sea were beating here, it would have had to have taken a huge amount of rock from here, and it should have dumped it down there. But as we look down there, we see a completely clear pathway with no debris whatsoever, and all the debris is gathered to one side. I find it difficult to see nature doing that. It seems more like human workmanship to me. In fact, there's a kind of wall along this side of the path, and a nice little gutter running along here. Other features on the top of the monument are rather interesting. A mixture of rectangles and curves, a megalith balanced on top of a platform, and the face. I'm just comparing it with this Olmec head, what a weathered face can look like. Let's just take you around the underwater face at Yonaguni. I'm in there just for scale. The eyes look due south, as does the mouth, hanging onto the eyes. In fact, there are pupils inside the eyes, carved. You can actually hold onto them with your hand. Here's a side view. The head is clearly demarcated from this real rock. There's a curious headdress here that you can see remnants of in the carving. And as we draw back from there, we find ourselves in a ceremonial area. Again, a beautiful straight pathway with gutters on either side. If nature did all of this in this small area, then it's truly an amazing and I would say unbelievable achievement. There are many huge megaliths in Japan. We don't know the origin of them at all. This one is called Masa Iwafune, the upside-down boat stone. There's some theories on when it was made, but you can't date stone by any useful technique, and we just don't know how old it is. When I go around to the other side of it, you can see how it was cut. These H-shaped patterns were cut, and then the higher areas would later have been removed. The work was never finished. Exactly the same thing underwater, been underwater for 12,000 years at Yonaguni, the same style of cutting stone revealed there. Further north, off the main island of Okinawa, gigantic stone circles underwater. I have not been given, and I've dived there with a very skeptical geologist, Wolf Wichmann. He was unable to come up with a natural explanation for how this huge stone circle could have been created. It's more than 100 feet underwater now. If you look at the way the uprights surround the central stone, you can see the issue here. The inner curve here matches the outer curve of the central upright. I think it's almost perverse to argue that this is natural in any way, but if we accept that it's man-made, then we have to say who created a monument on this scale more than 12,000 years ago when this area was last above water. Let's move towards India now. Again, off the coast of India, we have found extraordinary underwater ruins here at Mahabalipuram. This was our little expedition to go diving with the local fishermen who told us about these underwater monuments. We brought out a team from Britain and went diving with them in this rather low-tech way. And first thing we find as we get underwater is huge stone walls extending up kilometers from shore. The archaeological establishment denied it at the time until the Boxing Day tsunami emptied the bay in front of Mahabalipuram and showed everyone these monuments. Now the archaeologists are looking at them, but they'll only look at the ones very near to shore. The ones further from shore in deeper water have two disturbing implications for them. I'm just putting my diving knife between two of these blocks of stone to show the fine work that was done there. Lovely curved wall. Up on the northwest of India, side-scan sonar has revealed extensive underwater ruins at a depth of 120 feet. Nobody's yet been able to dive on these ruins. There's security concerns. It's very close to the border with Pakistan, and fantastic currents which are very, very dangerous to divers operating in that area. But it seems that we have huge structures underwater, actually two running in parallel beside the beds of ancient rivers. Would be most intriguing to carry out the research there. And over off North America, where the Piri Reis map shows an island that does not exist today, we find underwater the famous Bimini Road with its extraordinary characteristics. I think that we need to look with fresh eyes above water as well as underwater. This Piri Reis map, by the way, is drawn on a rather sophisticated modern projection. It's an azimuthal equidistant projection, and it turns out to be based on Cairo, on Giza. And if we go to Giza, we find the Great Sphinx confronting us, gazing perfectly due east, and the question is, how long has this monument been looking in that direction? There is something truly prehistoric about the site and about the feel of the site. I think the Sphinx speaks to all of us of its vast antiquity and of the wisdom that it represents and carries down across the ages from one time to another, from then till now, whenever then was. Now, John West and Robert Schoch, I've no doubt, will be talking about the geological characteristics of the Sphinx and why they believe it to be much older than Egyptologists accept, thousands of years older. And if the Sphinx is older, then so too are these huge megalithic temples in front of it, which means not only do we have a very ancient monument, but also we have associated monuments that required huge engineering skills to build temples with blocks of stone weighing more than 200 tons. I'm on top of the Great here, of course, 480 feet high. I have to tell a little anecdote about this because I discovered that I have a family connection with the Great Pyramid. One of the times that Santa and I climbed the Great Pyramid, you see all this graffiti here that people have carved into the blocks. Actually, some of it goes back hundreds of years. Just behind where I'm standing on the second step, we found a little piece of graffiti, and that said, P. Hancock, April 12th, I think it was, 1916. And I knew that my grandfather had been in Egypt during the First World War. And I got on to my dad, who was still alive then, and got him to dig out my grandfather's diaries. And sure enough, on the very day, a short entry, climbed the Great Pyramid today. So it's just one of those amazing moments. There's something truly magical about the Great Pyramids, of course. They are designed and created to work on human consciousness, to break down our connection to this material realm and allow us to access a spiritual world, our true home, if all of the ancient traditions are to be understood and believed. Just a view of the pyramid here. I just want to talk a little bit about its amazing accuracy. As Robert mentioned, it's aligned to within 3/60ths of a degree of true north. This is really quite a staggering feat of astronomy and laying out. The Great Pyramid is also, whether our friends in the academic community like it or not, a scale model of the northern hemisphere of the Earth on a scale of 1 to 43,200. In other words, you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. And if you measure the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid, multiply that by the same number, 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. Egyptologists know this, but they say that it's a coincidence. I think that what absolutely rules it out being a coincidence is the number, is the 43,200. If it was 57,940, I would feel differently. But 43,200 is a significant number. And just a little bit of mathematics there. It's 2,160 times 20, and 2,160 itself is 30 times 72. Let's see why these numbers are significant. We're looking at an extraordinary work here. I would recommend everyone in this room who has not read Hamlet's Mill to do so, but I warn you, you'll have to read it 5 times before you get it. Because Giorgio de Santillana, who was the professor of history of science at Massachusetts Institute of technology. There he is there. It's very hard to find a photograph of him. And Hertha von Deschend wrote a deliberately coded book. They were quite aware of the devastating implications for the current paradigm of history of what they were putting into print. And so they made it like a treasure trail where you have to find your way to the facts. And I only really got it on the fifth read when I made very detailed notes and could compare material at the back to material at the front. What they're saying is that there was an advanced and almost unbelievable civilization of antiquity that had observed and documented a very hard-to-observe astronomical phenomenon, the phenomenon that Robert talked about, precession of the equinoxes, which is, of course, central to our concerns here at this conference, which unfolds at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years in round numbers. The full cycle, 360 by 72, 25,920 years. There's an ancient tradition allocating each of the 12 zodiac constellations 30 degrees along the ecliptic, so there you get your 30 by 72 equals 2,160 years, and the total coming to 25,920. 43,200 is one of these numbers. And this is what Santillana and von Deschend document at great length in Hamlet's Mill. You know, we have an argument here as to how precession is called, and Walter Cruttenden has done extraordinary work, important work, showing that the observable of precession, what's actually seen in terms of the changing background of the stars against the rising sun at particular times of the year, might not be caused by a wobble on the Earth's axis. It might be caused by our sun being part of a binary system and being involved in a huge circle-line journey through the heavens, which would produce exactly the same visual effects as this hypothetical wobble on the Earth's axis. But however it's called, it's important to be clear that the precession of the equinoxes, it doesn't change the rising sun at the equinoxes. Sun stays where it belongs, perfectly due east. It's the constellations that lie behind the sun, were you to stand an hour before dawn looking east, see a constellation on the horizon where the sun will rise. It's those constellations that change. They're the constellations that in ancient astrology house the sun at particular times of the year. And we are correctly said to be in the dawning of the age of Aquarius today, because the constellation of Aquarius is moving slowly into position behind the sun. And there is an ancient view that these archetypes in the heavens speak of a pattern, a character of the world age. Runs in the opposite direction to the annual path of the sun. Each age is 30 by 72, 2,160 years. When the constellation of Leo was housing the sun, we were back well over 12,000 years ago. And Robert and I, in the message of the Sphinx, really wanted to make an important issue of this extraordinary correlation, which, Robert's genius is to see what no one else sees, and yet is in plain view. And this is what Robert saw, that at that time, on the spring equinox, 12.5, these alignments hold good for about 1,000 years, 12.5, 13,500 years ago, as the sun was rising due east, it was the constellation of Leo that housed the sun, and here we have a lion-bodied monument gazing due east towards the sun, and at the very moment that the sun strikes the horizon, that's when Orion's belt crosses the meridian, mirrored on the ground by the pattern of the three pyramids. And as Robert made clear, this does not mean that the pyramids were built in 10,500 or 11,500 BC, but it does mean, once you take it in context of the whole flavor and atmosphere of the ancient Egyptian stellar religion, it does, to Robert and I, say very strongly that this site is speaking of that ancient period, speaking back to it, and that there may indeed be structures on the site that date from that time, which were constantly replenished and rebuilt, just as many of the great Christian cathedrals stand on top of earlier monuments. 72 is the heartbeat of the precessional cycle, and this is the point that Santillana and von Deschend were making, that there are myths all over the world that include these numbers and multiples of these numbers, 4,320 there in a multiple. Osiris captured by Seth and his 72 assistants. There's just a huge range of correspondences to these numbers in ancient myths, and all of them associated with the idea of the collapse and demise of world ages and the rebirth of the world into a new pattern. Just briefly to show that there are a number of sites around the world that are connected by significant numbers of degrees of longitude. I think that this is testimony to not only an ancient mapping of the world, but to an ancient endeavor to establish sacred sites on degrees of longitude that were related through that number system to Giza, which was the ancient zero meridian. And 72 degrees east of Giza, exactly, we come to the temples of Angkor in Cambodia, which themselves sit upon much earlier temples. We don't know how far back actually the Angkor site goes, although it was in its present incarnation, it was built in the 1100s of our era. This is Angkor Wat, perfectly straight east-west alignment disappearing there on the horizon. And Angkor, like the Sphinx, looks at the equinoctial sun. And here we're standing on the causeway and just following the sun as it rises up the central tower until it sits on top and lights the whole place up like a fairyland, like a fairy kingdom. So the whole gigantic temple complex is built to speak of this moment, dawn, on the spring equinox. And there are 72 major temples at Angkor, not an accident in my view. There are extraordinary sculptures and works of art, which feature particularly gigantic snakes, gigantic serpents, and also a kind of churning motion, which is the ancient symbol for precession. This churning of the Milky Ocean, as it's called here, where the huge serpent Vasuki is wrapped around Mount Mandara, and the gods pull together on the body of Vasuki the serpent and churn the Milky Ocean, producing Amrita, which is the nectar of immortality. There's always a connection to immortality in these ancient systems that tie sky to ground, the quest for immortality, a kind of science of immortality. When you take the main temples, you find that they are laid out on the ground in the pattern of a constellation in the sky. It is the serpent constellation, the dragon, Draco. And weirdly, just as at Giza, the correlation only becomes perfect in the very distant past. In fact, the exact same epoch as Giza, 10,500 BC on the spring equinox. Now, stellar positions, as I say, they don't change so much in 1,000 years, and the positions here hold good, but certainly between 12 and 13,000 years ago. And if you look at it on a global scale, it's really rather bizarre. Orion's belt is crossing the meridian at dawn on the spring equinox. It's at the lowest point in its precessional journey. It rises up and down in the heavens. On the other side of the seesaw, the constellation of Draco lies due north, directly opposite Orion, at the highest point in its precessional cycle, the one that's mapped at Angkor. And we have Leo rising in the east and Aquarius setting in the west. That's 12,500 years ago. Now, all I know is that something really bad happened to the world at that time, which caused the Ice Age to melt down cataclysmically. I've never been absolutely sure what it was, and I've put forward and presented the evidence for a variety of different theories for the cause. But just recently, new evidence has come out, which seems to prove conclusively that a gigantic comet hit the Earth, actually hit North America, in 10,900 BC, approximately 12,900 years ago, which is exactly in the frame of the period that I have argued for a long time seems to be the time when we lost a great civilization. That comet would have done it. And it was accompanied by massive extinctions all around the planet. We very easily could have lost a whole civilization in that period. And there's more. I think that this astronomy may be suggesting a direct connection between that former age, the age of the fall of Atlantis, and our age today. And it's a game that's played with the monuments and the stars in the sky. So here's rise in 10,500 BC, Leo rising in the east, and Aquarius setting in the west, Orion in the south, Draco in the north. If we come to our epoch, we find that Leo and Aquarius have exactly swapped positions. Now Aquarius is rising and Leo is setting. And if we go to sunset in our epoch, we find the seesaw of Orion and Draco has gone from Orion at its lowest point and Draco at its highest to Draco at its lowest and Orion at its highest. Now, I'm not saying that these alignments in the heavens are actually causing problems on Earth. I'm saying that they were used, perhaps, as a signpost by the ancients to send a message down across the ages, a message that could be read by any astronomically literate civilization, assuming, of course, that it was not a civilization governed by the mindset of modern Egyptology, in which case the notion of a message being passed down to us from antiquity is completely absurd. I can't help feeling that there's something going on here, and that some voice is speaking to us from the past, and that what that voice is saying is a warning of some sort. Interestingly, of course, the Mayan calendar does speak a warning in very plain language for our own period. 21st of December 2012 in our calendar is the time that the Maya say this world age comes to an end. It's hard to interpret exactly what they mean, but they did believe that every previous world age, and they envisaged many of them, had been brought by cataclysmic events. And here we see the destruction of the world in the Dresden Codex. It's following a sequence of larger and larger numbers called serpent numbers. And it speaks of the end of our time, of the end of our age. Is there a great cataclysm to come? The Mayan calendar makes use of exactly the same system of numbers that we find encoded in ancient myth and ancient monuments all around the world. Some kind of code for us to disentangle, and that code always speaks of the breaking of a world age and the birth of a new one. And it is either our bad fortune or good fortune that we live precisely in one of those times when an age is about to end. The Maya also used pyramids and aligned them to the sun at certain times of the year. This one, the pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza, is an equinoctial monument as well, just like the Sphinx and like Angkor. It uses a different technique. That serpent head is completed with the shadow body of a serpent on the spring equinox each year. So it's doing this, what this and this do, but in a different way, by the precise positioning of the monument. And John Major Jenkins has shown that 60 days after that equinoctial alignment occurs, in our time and our time only, the exact zenith above the pyramid points directly to the Pleiades. And they've been moving slowly into that position for thousands of years. So again, he's arguing that here is a clock using the heavens to tell us, pay attention. This time, your time, when the Pleiades are at zenith 60 days after the equinox, is a time of enormous gravity in the history of the world. That comet, we don't know exactly when it hit, but if it hit in 10,948 BC, then exactly 12,960 years has passed since then, and that is exactly 1/2 of the precessional cycle. And so, in my wilder flights of speculation, I wonder whether this warning may have something to do with a comet, a long-period comet. Perhaps the Earth didn't sweep up all the pieces of that comet when it hit us in 10,900 and so BC. Comets frequently fragment into many pieces, and it's possible to envisage a return of the remaining segments of that comet. But there is another view in the Mayan system. It doesn't have to be a cataclysmic end of the world. It could equally well be a remaking or a renewal of the world as we enter a world age. And that's why I think the issue of human consciousness today is so important, and why it's so dangerous that our consciousness is being systematically shut down by the society that we live in today. Perhaps what we need to be getting ready for is not a horrendous disaster and darkness, but a rebirth of human consciousness. And John Major Jenkins' work, again, incredibly important in this area, in showing what the Maya were actually pointing to in the heavens on the 21st of December 2012. And that is the moment when, after thousands of years of journey, on the winter solstice, the 21st of December, rises dead center in the Milky Way, a symbol of cosmic rebirth is being suggested here. I think that the choice really is very much up to us. Do we confront the end of civilization as we know it, or do we confront the transformation of human beings into something completely new? And we live at one of those crossroad moments in human history when the choice is ours. And I think the unease that all of us feel in our hearts today is rightly grounded when we look back at the message from the past. These warnings, which speak of a destruction out of which a new world emerges, are found in many traditions, many ancient traditions. And I just want to close this presentation with a reading. Robert and John Anthony West also from time to time read from this amazing text. It's called the Asclepius. It purports to be part of a dialogue between the god Hermes and his pupil Asclepius. The god Hermes was simply the Greek version of the ancient Egyptian wisdom god Thoth. And I think that although the text, which is about 2,000 years old, drawing on much older traditions that passed down through ancient Egypt, there's no doubt of the ancient Egyptian origin of the Hermetic tradition. I think that this text, although it speaks of Egypt, speaks to us and to our time in a way that we should listen with great care. So it's Hermes talking to Asclepius, and he says, "Do you know, Asclepius, that Egypt is an image of heaven? Or to speak more exactly, in Egypt all the operations of the powers which rule and work in heaven are present in the earth below. In fact, it should be said that the whole cosmos dwells in this our land, as in a sanctuary. And yet, since it is fitting that wise men should have knowledge of all events before they come to pass, you must not be left in ignorance of what I will now tell you. There will come a time when it will have been in vain that Egyptians have honored the Godhead with heartfelt piety and service, and all our holy worship will be fruitless and ineffectual. Gods will return from earth to heaven. Egypt will be forsaken, and the land which once was the home of religion will be left desolate, bereft of the presence of its deities. O Egypt, Egypt, of thy religion nothing will remain but an empty tale, which thine own children in time to come will not believe. Nothing will be left but graven words, and only the stones will tell of thy piety. And in that day, men will be weary of life, and they will cease to think the universe worthy of reverent wonder and worship. They will no longer love this world around us, this incomparable work of God, this glorious structure which he has built, this sum of good made up of many diverse forms, this instrument whereby the will of God operates in that which he has made, ungrudgingly favoring man's welfare, this combination and of all the manifold things that call forth the veneration, praise, and love of the beholder. Darkness will be preferred to light, and death will be thought more profitable than life. No one will raise his eyes to heaven. The pious will be deemed insane, the impious wise. The madman will be thought a brave man, and the wicked will be esteemed as good. As for the soul, and the belief that it is immortal by nature, or may hope to attain to immortality, as I have taught you, all this they will mock, and even persuade themselves that it is false. No word of reverence or piety, no utterance worthy of heaven, will be heard or believed. And so the gods will depart from mankind, a grievous thing. And only evil angels will remain, who will mingle with men and drive the poor wretches into all manner of reckless crime, into robberies and frauds and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. Then will the earth tremble, and the sea bear no ships. Heaven will not support the stars in their orbits. All the voices of the gods will be forced into silence. The fruits of the earth will rot, the soil will turn barren, and the very air will sicken with sullen stagnation. All things will be disordered and awry. All good will disappear. But when all this has befallen Asclepius, then God, the creator of all things, will look on that which has come to pass and will stop the disorder by the counterforce of his will, which is the good. He will call back to the right path those who have gone astray. He will cleanse the world of evil, washing it away with floods, burning it out with the fiercest fire, and expelling it with war and pestilence. And thus he will bring back his world to its former aspect, so that the cosmos will more be deemed worthy of worship and wondering reverence. And God, the maker and maintainer of the mighty fabric, will be adored by the men of that day with continuous songs of praise and blessing. Such is the new birth of the cosmos. It is a making again of all things good, a holy and awe-inspiring restoration of all nature, and it is wrought inside the process of time by the eternal will of the Creator. So I feel there is a message for us coming down to antiquity, and it is a warning, and it is also a holding out of hope. The unique responsibility of the human creature, as opposed to other creatures on this planet, is that we have the power of choice. That's what we have, and that's what we must exercise if we wish to live in accordance with the mandate of heaven rather than against it. We need to start exercising choice again. Huge instruments in our society prevent us from exercising a choice. One need only think of so-called reality TV, which blitzes our minds from morning to night with absolute meaningless pap. How is it possible, growing up in a household inundated with this kind of material, how is it possible to think the very tools with which we think are being stolen from us? At the same time, our governments are deeply hostile to individuals who wish to explore their own consciousness in an intelligent manner. It's not the theme of this talk, but I have spent the last 4 years working with an ancient South American hallucinogen called ayahuasca. It's been used for thousands of years in the Amazon as a portal to the spirit realms. Our society doesn't like people exploring their own consciousness. It's considered to be dangerous, and all sorts of propaganda and nonsense is spewed out at us by the instruments of government control. But I must say very strongly, as an adult, I feel that if I am not sovereign over my own consciousness, then I'm not sovereign over anything. And it's pointless to talk in highfalutin terms about democracy and what the West has to teach the rest of the world. This democracy is a fallacy, an illusion. based on lies and false information. Unfortunately, it is in our society. Those evil angels spoken of in the Hermetic text are indeed mingling amongst us today. They're called our politicians. And thank you. It's time that we wrested control over our own destiny back. I think we've grown out of the age of the state. It's time to grow into a new age. These huge bureaucracies, bloated with public money, levied from our own hard work, and then turned against us, need to be changed if we are to live a better life in the future. In the Amazon, the shamans tell me that the disaster that is being unleashed upon the world by Western civilization, it is so because our civilization has severed its connection with spirit. I feel a mission to the West, a mission to the North, to help us reconnect with spirit again. And I think that rather than regarding ourselves as the apex and pinnacle of creation and civilization, we need to sit at the feet of those shamans, to sit at the feet of ancient civilizations like Egypt, which devoted its best minds for 3,000 years to considering the mysteries of existence. We need to sit at their feet and listen to what they have to tell us. We must not be, again, that proud and arrogant, domineering people who call down the anger of the gods upon themselves. We need to be humble and decent, generous, free-spirited, and kind. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.